Hey guys, I just finished setting up a new terrarium for some amazing toads with supplies I purchased from New England Herpeticulture. NE Herp is the sponsor of today's episode of the Frograck Podcast. They have been my first choice for terrarium supplies since they opened their doors in 2009. I keep shopping with NE Herp because Mike and Jessica are hobbyists first. They continue to have first-hand experience building vivariums and providing excellent care for captive herps. They have the best customer service, fast shipping, and a wide selection. I can always find the herp supplies I need at neherpeticulture.com. If you keep reptiles or amphibians, and you are looking to build the perfect bioactive habitat, NE Herp is your go-to source for terrariums, lighting, live plants, substrates, microfauna, wood, decor, supplements, feeder insect culturing supplies, and more. Like I said, everything you need in one place. Trusted nationwide by hobbyists, dart frog enthusiasts, and zoos, and your favorite Frograck podcaster. NE Herp is your one-stop vivarium shop. So head on over to neherpeticulture.com and pick up the supplies you need to support your herp hobby. Thank you, NE Herp, for supporting today's episode of the Frograck Podcast. Welcome to the Frograck Podcast. I'm your host, Joe Mayotte, Frograck on social media, Morph Market, and Frograck.com. If you are here listening to this extremely niche podcast about amphibians in captivity and you enjoy the content, give this podcast a like, subscribe, and share, because you're not the only one. There are thousands of other basement-dwelling amphibian files like us who haven't heard about the Frograck Podcast, so help me spread the word. For today's episode, I'm joined by Twohy to talk about newts and toads because I'm a little biased and it's my podcast. Welcome, Sean. How are you?
Good. How's it going?
It's going good. Why don't you tell the audience a little bit about who you are, where you're from, and why I found you to get on the podcast, what you keep?
Sure. So I live out in Washington State, out in the Pacific Northwest. Actually split my time between the two sides of the state. So I live just outside of Seattle in a city called Monroe, and then I teach on the other side of the state. And so I see both sides of what we have out here. I keep a lot of stuff, but primarily right now I keep toads and newts. I have a morph market that is toads and newts is what I have on there. And I primarily keep and breed Synops cyanaris, or some people want to call it Hypsilotriton cyanaris, I think is the more suggested name now. And then bumblebee toads, Melanophreniskis species. I don't think anybody knows what the specific one is. Klappenbachii? Yeah. And so those are the two that I keep and breed. And then I also have Tylotetriton changing, and I have a pair of Eastern newts. We're not allowed to have Eastern newts in Washington State, but I got them through a guy on a fish website who said he was going to release them. And so I got them, and then I wrote the state and said, hey, what do you want me to do with these? And they said, we don't care. Just keep them, but just don't breed them, don't release them or anything like that. And so I have a pair of those, two males. And then what else do I have? I have some poppy eye newts, a couple of groups of those, but I haven't bred them or anything like that. And then I have a tortoise. I have a couple of California red-sided garters, and then I keep a lot of fish. So I have kind of that side of me too.
Awesome. Yeah, so before you got deep into the amphibian hobby, you started off as an aquarium keeper. Tell us a little bit about that hobby and when you started in it and what sort of fish you keep. I think you're mostly interested in freshwater, is that right?
Yeah, I only keep freshwater. So I think I've talked about this with you a little bit before, but I like things that don't have to have a heater. Some of the stuff I do have a heater for, but if the heater went out and they went down to 50 degrees, 40 degrees, they'd probably be fine for a little while. And so with fish keeping, it's the same thing. I have planted tanks and things like that, but everything I keep is subtropical. What I would say, we were talking about this, but subtropical or temperate. I don't know what the difference would be for sure, but I keep subtropical. And then I don't know how I got into that. I've been keeping fish for like probably 15 years or something seriously. And then before that, as a kid, keeping whatever my parents would let me bring home from a pet shop. I out here in Washington, we have some pretty big fish shops, but also like the people associated with them. So Aquarium Co-op is out here, and the guy who runs Aquarium Co-op has a pretty big social media presence, and he's pretty well known in the fish hobby. And he's just, a 30-minute drive away from me. And then there's a couple of other really cool aquarium shops. And I think that happens because it's harder to keep reptiles in Washington State. At least you can't have like outdoor reptiles out here except for a couple months in the year. I think our aquarium hobby really took off because of that. Also, we have a lot of water, so that's probably part of it. Is like
Yeah.
you can uh and our water is good. Our water out of the tap. Most people who do water changes in their fish tank, they don't have to do anything to it. You can just run that straight into your fish tank and they're going to be fine. You could use a dechlorinator if you wanted, but I've done 50% water changes on all my fish tanks for a long time without any problems. So I got into that. One of the things I think that happened and why I got into fish, I am married to somebody who has 4 kids, and when we met, they had 4 kids, and it kind of changed my ability to have hobbies.
Yeah.
So, when you get into a relationship with somebody who has a lot of kids, you're kind of fitting in your personal time in between all of the soccer games and the things like that you have to do. And then on top of that, I've been teaching on the east side and living on the west side. It's a 3-hour difference between where I live on the west side and where I have a house on the east side. I have a little 600 square foot house that I live in when I'm teaching over there. And so, I'm really there's a lot of splitting up of my time and stuff. And so keeping fish was something that worked well in the little bits of time that I had to do whatever hobby I wanted to do. So I could set up a tank if I had a couple hours. I could go get a fish on my way over to the east side. I could stop at one of the aquarium shops and get some sort of fish. If I had something over on the east side in a tank, a fish is going to do fine for 3.5 days. So I could have fish over there, especially in a planted tank with a small fish. So I could have stuff over there and then I could have stuff over here and I could kind of split that up. And so for me, I think that's where the hobby started, is just trying to find something that I could do that wasn't that could just fit in to wherever I needed it to fit in. And yeah, I mean, especially driving across the state, it's really easy to stop at a fish shop on the way over there and then grab something. And then podcasts, I'm making these 3-hour drives twice a week. So podcast became a thing. And then you start listening to podcasts and you're listening to people talk about fish keeping, or you're listening to people talk about reptiles or whatever. And then, you can only listen to somebody talk about something so long before you're like, oh, I want to go get this thing or whatever. So that's kind of
Right,
how
right.
the fish keeping side of it came. I got really into heavily planted tanks. So I used to have a tank right behind me that was like a 20-gallon. It was just full of plants. And then usually I would just put really small fish. So I don't do anything that you would have to put into a 50-gallon or 55-gallon tank later on. Everything I do is, like an inch and under typically. And part of that is I like building out the ecosystem. I like to think about how everything works together and try to get everything almost self-sustaining. And then, I just feed once every 3 days or something, and that's all that's keeping it alive. And then even water changes, I would, on most of my planted tanks, I'd only have to do water changes maybe once every 6 months or something. Whereas if you keep a tank that's almost empty or doesn't have a lot of plants, you might be doing a water change that's, once a week or something like that.
Right. Right. Yeah, so cool. The aquarium co-op people, that tends to be where I buy my brine shrimp supplies to keep the newly hatched newts going. They have good products, really reliable hatch on the eggs the brine shrimp eggs they sell. Yeah, there's
Yeah,
so
and
much that amphibian hobby people can learn from the aquarium side of things. If you came from building those aquatic environments into amphibians, some people come from keeping reptiles into amphibians, and it's approaching amphibian keeping from two very different angles. What do you think, as someone who knows about aquarium keeping, knows about water quality, what do you think are like the most important things that transferred from one hobby to the next?
I think it's way easier to start in fish keeping and then move to amphibians. So, even when you just think about, well, okay, so there's a lot of directions I could come at this from. So, water quality is a big one, right? Amphibians are sensitive, and so when you're a fish keeper, you are very careful about when you add fish to an aquarium. So most people will call that cycling a tank or something like that. And you're basically allowing good bacteria and bad bacteria to kind of build up and create an equilibrium in the tank so that when you put the fish in, you're not shocking them or you're not creating an environment that's going to be stressful. Like there's some really simple things that if you don't keep fish and then you start keeping fish, you don't realize why stuff is happening. So a lot of people who are listening to this probably went out and bought a fish at some point. They put it in a fish tank, and then 3 days later, that fish tank turned bright white, and they thought, "Oh no, like what am I doing wrong here? How can I fix that?" It just has to do with you don't have any sort of equilibrium between good bacteria, bad bacteria in there. And so your aquarium has filled up with a certain kind of bacteria. Your fish are actually probably fine in that, but it's going to look ugly for a while. So a lot of times fish keepers are very aware of that. They'll take water from old aquariums and put it in new ones, and kind of there's a lot of ways to work around that. So water quality is a big one. I think for me, because I like to keep a lot of fish I like to keep stuff that's a little bit more unique and is a little bit more difficult to keep on flake food or on like a dry food. So I grow a lot of my own live foods. I have whiteworm cultures. I have a wine fridge with a bunch of whiteworm cultures. I keep Daphnia. I actually was just posting about Daphnia on one of these feeder Facebook pages. So I do a lot of Daphnia. I actually have a tattoo of Daphnia on my arm. I don't know if you
Awesome.
can see it. My wife does tat tattoos, and so this was her first tattoo, her practice tattoo. And then if I were to take you outside here, you would just see like I have tubs and tubs of water just to collect mosquitoes, which my wife loves, and mosquito larvae. And so I'll go out there in the summer and just be catching mosquitoes all summer long. I do blackworms. I do for fish. That's probably the main ones I do for fish. But if you get into caudates, then you start to see that being able to culture live foods is pretty important. And so when it comes to getting little larvae of newts, my first time I bred my newts, I think I got 160 larvae of Cyanarus,
Wow.
and I got them all to adulthood because I just had so many Daphnia, so many mosquito larvae, stuff that I could feed them, that I just had a lot of success. And I didn't do anything special as far as like enclosure. I just kept them all in. I had a 29 gallon, and I just kept them all in this 29 gallon. Did a little bit of water changes, and then when they got a little bit bigger, I started splitting them into groups. But I would counted them all one time, like at the beginning, and then I counted them all at the end, and I think I lost like three out of the
Yeah.
whole group that I had. I think I lost like three of them. So I think that's because of fish keeping. If I hadn't,
I've been anti blackworm from day one with newts. They're just stinky and expensive. And so the very first newt species I bred, I think it was 2014, I bred Nerergus strachii, which is like a really rare newt
yeah,
now.
that's a good one.
But it was an awesome newt, and at the time they weren't quite that rare, or maybe just the hobby was smaller, so when someone produced them, you could get them. And mosquito larvae, once again, don't tell the rest of my family. Mosquito larvae is what got me through that because I was brand new to culturing live foods. I could figure out brine shrimp, but just barely. And that really only gets you started, as you know. But you can go outside in buckets and puddles and get those mosquito larvae. And the newt larvae really did well on those to the point where I could get them to grow larger. So yeah, that's a little secret. I don't like relying on that now because, man, you just don't want mosquitoes in your house or around. But part of me really wants to have a nice separate greenhouse or building for newt larvae so that I can use mosquito larvae more and not have it affect my family.
Yeah, I feel like my wife is in the kitchen over here, so she probably disagrees, but I feel like we don't have any more mosquitoes around our house than we normally would because I'm going out and I'm
Okay.
collecting them every day. I'm like going out and swiping all of the mosquitoes out of there. And what I usually do is when you look at fish nets, there's usually two types. There's a blue one and a white one, and the blue one has a little bit bigger holes. And so I actually separate out my feeders for different sizes of larvae that way. So I'll collect with the white net and then I'll use the blue net to separate out bigger mosquitoes from smaller ones. And then if I have two sizes of larvae, I can feed two different sizes. And I do that with fish too. And I do that with Daphnia as well because, you know, Daphnia magna are pretty big, but when they first come out, most fish larvae can take them if you separate them out by size. So I'll do that. And so I don't know that the adult size of mosquito larvae have a chance to get out. Obviously, some of them do. Otherwise, there wouldn't be any more mosquitoes for me to get more mosquito larvae. But I don't know. I don't see any more than we normally would have. The thing that they really hate more than anything in this house is the fruit flies. Fruit flies are a much bigger problem for them, I think, than the mosquitoes.
Really? I think I definitely go through the effort. Any new enclosure I set up that's going to have an animal in it that eats fruit flies, I go through a lot of fruit fly proofing efforts using silicone or those fuzzy window stripping. If the mesh lid that the terrarium came with from the factory has too big of holes, I'll replace it and use tight fitting window screening. I also have my animals down in the basement, and so the very, very few fruit flies that do escape don't make it into the rest of the house, thank goodness. And then most of juvenile animals that I raise, I'm raising them in gasketed tubs. And so, again, fruit flies don't tend to get out of those very much.
Yeah. Yeah,
But
I
it can
don't.
be a,
I
it
hope
can be a
nobody.
make
I hope.
it. Go ahead.
Well, I hope nobody in my family listens to this because I've got these enclosures. I'm in the dining room. I'm at the kitchen table right now, so I'm feeding fruit flies to some. So right here is Tylotriton, but next to me is smaller newts, poppy eye, and then the eastern newts, and I feed those fruit flies, and they're not great at catching them, and so I think part of the problem for me is that I leave for 4 days at a time. So before I leave, I usually feed pretty heavy, and I think that's where the problem really comes. If I just feed a regular amount, I don't really have fruit flies escaping or not anything significant. But it's when I'm like trying to like, put extra in there, then some of them always get out. But I also, just to like protect my name in this house, I also feel like some of our if there's flying fruit flies, I don't feel like that's me. I feel like that's them, but they blame every fruit fly on me. So,
This I've been explaining this to my family members for 22
yeah.
years, and they still blame me for. Yeah, I said if that fruit fly, it's probably a drain fly. It's probably not even a fruit fly that just landed in your
Yeah.
coffee.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, live
Yeah.
foods.
So,
Live foods are a make it or break it for a lot of hobbyists. There's people who will not deal with fruit flies, who think culturing fruit flies is burdensome. I'm just the opposite. I prefer that over getting mealworms and cockroaches and crickets and trying to deal with those. But yep, it's different
yeah,
strokes for different folks, I guess.
I had some firebelly toads. I got some firebelly toads and they started breeding like crazy. And this was like 3 years ago when I feel like it was still, you were looking at $50 a piece for a firebelly toad. Now it's come down. You can find them for $35 a piece. But I had them breeding and I had one group that was 200 firebelly toads and I hadn't tried to breed them. It was like not, they laid eggs and I was like, and actually the first set of eggs they laid, I think there were like 100 of them. And I was like, I'm just not going to do anything with these. I don't have space to be breeding these. I'm not gonna. And then they laid another set. I had 8 adults, and so they laid another set. There were like 200 eggs, and so I put them into a 40-gallon tank, and then they all grew up. Firebelly toadlets eat fruit flies a little bit off the bat, and then they grow out of those very quickly. So with bumblebee toads, I feed my adults fruit flies, and they're just fine. They're all like big and healthy. Firebelly toads don't grow on fruit flies the way that bumblebee toads do, and so I was buying crickets. I was buying 2,000 crickets a week or something crazy. And it's like at the end of that, you know, I'm going to run out of space. I have them in my garage. I've got all these toads in this 40-gallon tank that is not sustainable. I'm doing water changes like every other day to try to keep that up. And then so I ended up selling them. I mean, I bet I ended up selling them on average for like 15 or $20 a piece max. And to do that, the amount of effort to sell off that many animals, to get them into individual hobbyists, but then also to sell them to like local reptile shops and pet stores and stuff. And then the amount I spent on crickets,
Yeah.
it just wasn't worth it. And it's really the feeder insects for me also that become the problem. I have some tarantulas, and I'll get them when I vend at a reptile show. Somebody will just, I have a good relationship with Tyler at Spider Shop. He's a guy that's out here, and he'll buy some stuff off of me. And every once in a while, he'll just be like, "Oh, do you want one of these? Do you want one of these tarantula slings or whatever?" And I'll get one. When they get adults, I don't want them anymore because I don't want to have to buy crickets. Like I hate the
Right,
buying
right.
crickets. Like I'm on board. I agree with you completely. And it's not that it's that big of a deal. It's just like to keep crickets, you have to have a separate container that the crickets go in, and you got to feed the crickets, and you got to keep them warm. And if they start dying, they start smelling. And yeah, I agree. I think fruit flies are a lot easier if you
Yep.
can get away with it.
Here's how I navigate. I have some animals that definitely need and appreciate crickets, and it's seasonal. I have a small greenhouse on my property. I think you do as well, right? In the summertime, when I know it's going to be above 60 degrees in there day and night, even if it gets to like 95, 100 during the day and 65 at night. So for about half of the year where I live, 6 months out of the year, I can have cricket bins out there. So any smell is outside with fresh, there's ventilation in the greenhouse. Any escapees stay outside. They don't come into the house. And so during those months, I buy and feed a lot more crickets than other times of the year. And then for the winter months, when I can't have large colonies of crickets on hand, I use other feeders. I use red runner roaches, mealworms, waxworms, phoenix worms, the black soldier fly larvae, which are super easy to deal with. And I get my animals through the winter on those with just like the occasional small order of crickets that like I basically feed out all the crickets within 3 days and then wait a while. So,
Yeah.
because
Yeah,
there's
red runner.
in my life, there's been some species of amphibians that I really, really want to keep. And so I had to bite the bullet and deal with crickets.
Yeah. I like red runner roaches. They're kind of similar as crickets in that you have to have like a separate enclosure for them sometimes, but you can get away with putting them in like a fruit fly cup with like, some places for them to crawl on for a while with the red runner roaches. But yeah, I'll use those sometimes for tarantulas too.
Yeah. Yeah, the red runners, they just never die. For
Yeah.
better or worse.
That's what's nice about them.
Don't let them get
Yeah.
out. But yeah,
Yeah.
if
So
you
we
order
were talking
1,000 red runners, even 2 or 3 months later, they're all still alive. They're not dying like crickets
Yeah.
do. So
Yeah. So we were talking about, the fish hobby to amphibians. So,
yeah, yeah,
the two things, so the feeders was easy to move over, and then the water quality. And then I think also like I started out with Sayanaris, which I think is the most aquatic. Maybe the Spanish rib newt is more aquatic if there is one that's more aquatic, but I think blue tail firebelly newts are pretty aquatic. And so when I first started looking for newts, I was looking for those specifically because I wanted a newt that I could keep like a fish. I didn't
nice.
want an I didn't want to have any reptiles or anything. I didn't want any. Actually, I had my tortoise. I have my tortoise for like 20 years, but that's almost like this separate part of my life that doesn't even have to do with the rest of my hobby
Because
interests
it's
or
not
anything.
aquatic at all.
Yeah, well, it might be. I mean, I have the garter snakes now too, but it's just because it's I had that tortoise. I got that tortoise when I was in college, and that was 20 more than 20 years now, and he's small. When I first got him, I didn't know how to take care of reptiles, and so he's the size of a cheeseburger,
Hmm.
and he just has never gotten any bigger than that. When I first got him, he started getting MBD signs, and that's where I started learning about all of that stuff, and then I figured out how to take care of him. Now, he's out. I built him at a 4x8 garden bed that he lives in for 4 or 5 months out of the year, and then he's in the garage the rest of the time. So he's good now, but he just doesn't it doesn't I don't this is going to sound bad probably, but I don't have an interest in him. So like if somebody were to come to me today and be like, "Oh, do you want to get another tortoise?" I would never get another tortoise. I don't care about tortoises. He's like a house plant that I can't let die, and I don't want to give to someone because I feel like they're not going to take care of him well enough. And so I keep him just like, you know, because I took on that responsibility, and I feel like I just need to keep him for as long as I'm alive. I just got to keep keeping him. But he doesn't feel the same as like, when I come home and I'm doing water changes, or I'm like going and like making new fruit fly cultures or whatever. That's what I think of when I think of like me and having this hobby. I don't really think about like, oh, I got to go out and collect dandelion greens and feed the tortoise. He just kind of does his own thing most of the time. But yeah, so I started out, I'm like moving around a bunch of
No,
places,
that's fine.
but
Yeah, I'm curious. How did you? So you were keeping aquariums for quite a while. You had a tortoise. How did you even become aware of newts as a pot? Like, how did they catch your eye? It sort of, you mentioned that it integrated well. There's a good transition. Oh, I could keep an aquatic amphibian much the same way I keep fish. But how did you even hear about them?
so So I remembered them from the pet store, before there was the ban in 2017, 18. Actually, I think it's 16, 17. But before there was that ban, um, I remember going into pet stores and there'd be a newt and a firebelly toad in a tank that's half full of water. That was in all the pet stores around me, but I think everywhere.
Yeah.
And I just got this idea because I was getting so into planted tanks, and I was trying to design them in different ways. And, I got this idea like, oh, it'd be cool to have kind of a half water, half land kind of setup kind of thing. And so I originally was just thinking about newts for that reason. And then when I started looking for them, same thing that happened to a lot of people, I was like, oh, you can't get them anymore. Like they're not anywhere. And then you realize, oh, you can get them, but they have to be already here in the country. And nobody had been breeding them because they were $2 animals. So nobody was breeding them before there was a ban. And so then it sort of set off this, I had already with fish gotten to this place where I was going down rabbit holes. A lot of us do that where we get an idea. We're like, oh, this looks like a cool species. I want to get that. You research it for three months or whatever the amount of time is. You look for it. You try to find it at your local shops. If it's not there, maybe you go online and you try to see if there's anyone selling it. I had done that with a bunch of different types of fish, probably 5 or 6 different species of fish that I was interested. I was breeding or attempting to breed vampire plecos, which is a very specific fish. Like it wasn't in the wheelhouse of what I normally was keeping. It was like a hot. You had to have your tank at like 75, 80 degrees, and it was a weird species for me to be trying to do, but they were like $60 a piece. So I already had like this idea of like, oh, you can spend a lot of money on an animal. You can spend a lot of time researching it, trying to figure out how to get it to breed, all of these different things. And so I started going down this path, and I did, I think, what a lot of people probably did, which is I went on Facebook and Instagram. I just searched for newt, like the word newt, and then any newt that popped up on there in the last like 2 years, I messaged the person. I said like, hey, where'd you get this newt? Like, do you know anybody? And just like went down that. I didn't know about some of the forums and stuff like that when I first started out for reptiles. So
Yeah.
I didn't I didn't know that Morph Market or Fauna Classifieds or any of that stuff existed. And so I'm just like blindly asking people. And I got a message back from somebody, and she wasn't a super serious keeper. She was just kind of, had some newts, and that was it. I don't even know how she got them. And she was like, yeah, I know a guy. He lives 3 hours away, and here's his contact. And so I reached out to this person who I don't know they had an Instagram that was like, it looked like a burner phone version of an Instagram. Like it was just so that they could have people reach out to them secretly. And they messaged back and they were like, yeah, I have some newts. We can meet at this place. And they're going to be $100 a piece. So I drove this is like, I'd never owned a newt, and I drove 3 hours away and paid $600 to a guy in a grocery store parking lot who I don't know his name for newts.
Yep.
And then, my my wife obviously was unhappy with all of this. She doesn't care about any of this stuff. She's supportive in a very passive way. Like I don't care. Don't tell me what you're doing here. And so yeah, I brought those newts home. They didn't actually breed the first year I had them. I think I was keeping them I was too nervous about them, and so I had them inside all the time. Then I moved them out to the garage, and they went through a cold period, probably got down to like 60. And then that was the year that they just started laying eggs. And I just was so interested in them at that time that I collected every egg. So, now I don't do that. They lay eggs and I'll go in and I'll grab some, put them in a different tank and, whatever. But at that time, every egg that got laid got pulled from the tank and then got put into a different tank. And I had them in with Brazilian pennywort. Do you know what that
Yep.
plant is?
Yep.
Yeah, and so what Synops species do is they lay a single egg and then they fold it in a leaf if they can. Some people use grocery store bags or they'll use other things, but I had so much Brazilian pennywort, and so it was really easy for me to pull eggs because every pennywort leaf that was folded, I knew had an egg in it. So I just plucked that leaf
Pluck the
off and put
leaf.
it in. Yep, and that's how I ended up having so many newts that first year. And then I took them to a reptile show out here, and I'm the only person that had newts at a reptile show in 5 years before that. I was the only person in Washington, I think, that was breeding and selling them at that time. There's a couple other people that were before me, and then there's people now that do, but before that, nobody had. So I actually, the first year I went to a reptile show, I sold out of everything. And I was the only person at that reptile show to sell out of everything. And I had Cynops, Cyanaris, and I had bumblebee toads. And I was selling bumblebee toads. I don't know if you'll hate this or if you'll appreciate it, but I was selling bumblebee toads for 50 a piece. So a pretty reasonable price. When I bought my bumblebee toads, I bought them for, I think I bought mine for like 80 a piece. And then I had to pay shipping. It was pretty expensive when I
Yep.
bought them. But
Yep.
now you go on Morph Market and you'll see people trying to sell 3 bumblebee toads for $400
Yeah.
sometimes and things
Funny.
like that.
There's a couple things about that story. So, I mean, the first thing that came to mind is just the reality of the internet age we live in. Because before that, I was into the hobby when I was a lot younger in the late 90s, and it's just what your local pet store had, or whether this is the fish hobby or amphibian or reptile hobby, or what you could find in a book. And the books weren't great back then. But now, like you said, you can deep dive on almost anything because of the internet. And then, of course, you mentioned it was really hard for you at first to find any for sale. There wasn't an easy to find sale listing for some blue-tail firebelly newts. And so you started messaging anyone who ever posted about it. And that is why a lot of people in the newt hobby are antisocial, grumpy old men. Because
Yeah.
if they have
You get a bunch of messages.
if they have a really cool rare newt and they are good at social media, their DMs fill up with hundreds of people asking, hey, can I get on a wait list? Do you have any for sale? When will you have any for sale? Because the supply is way greater than the demand. It's sort of like if you're listening to this and you're from the reptile end of
You
things.
mean the other way around?
Yes,
the other way around. The demand is higher than
demand is way too high. There's not enough supply of the newts. It's very similar to like obscure Australian geckos, because whatever's here in the hobby is here. There's not any more coming in, and really nerdy middle-aged men want to collect them all. And so that's like the amphibian version of that is newts. And so I'm here for it, by the way. I'm here for it. I like them.
Yeah, well, I told you this before, but when I first was reaching out to people, I'm almost positive that you were one of the people that I had reached out to. I mean, I reached out to everybody. So, I'm pretty sure that you were one of the people, but then, you didn't have any that were for sale or whatever, and so I moved on and then I found something. But what's also interesting about you saying that is it's funny because if you're trying to find a newt and you've never owned a newt, it's really hard to get through that first jump. But once you have newts and you start breeding them, it's actually not that hard. So like if I wanted to get a hold of something now, I have all these people that I would be like, "Oh, do you have any of this, or what do you have with this, or what could you do with that?" And so it's almost like drug dealers or something. Like if you want to buy drugs and you don't know anything, then it's going to be hard. You're going to go to a grocery store and they're going to be like, I don't know you. Like I don't know anything about this. But then once you're in, I have people like I've got friends that I've I have friends that I'll just ship something to. I'll be like, hey, I have a bunch of bumblebee toads. Like, do you want some? And I'll just ship them to them. I don't have them even send me money for shipping costs or anything. And then later they'll have something and they'll be like, oh, I'm going to send you some of this stuff. But it's like at the beginning, you don't know people. You don't know what they're going to be like. If they're somebody that you even trust to have an animal, you don't know if they're going to try to like, you know, breed these things like crazy and then just like there's going to be too many in the market and then people are going to end up letting them go in creeks or something. Like you don't know what any of it is, so you're kind
Yeah.
of careful, but once you're in,
Yep.
it's a different.
That's very true. That's very true. Before newts became scarce, like you mentioned, when firebelly newts were coming into the country wild collected, and every single pet store in America had them in stock year round for $5, which is really a travesty to just be taking that many animals from the wild just to feed the pet stores, the pet hobby like that. So I think we're in a better place today. But back in the day, the really passionate keepers who were on the newt forums and sharing information with each other, it was very common back then to give away eggs for basically free. Like, my fire-bellied newts or my crested newts laid eggs. I don't want to raise 100 of these. Does anyone? I'm willing to just give them away. And people in the hobby were in it for passion. And I think you mentioned one reason why that changed: the ban of new imports. The other thing was when the Nereus, the Middle Eastern newt species, first came in around 2008. Those are amazing animals. Anyone who's familiar with them or has seen a picture knows that. They're beautiful, they're unique, they do make good captives. When those first came in, it was the first time anyone saw a newt sell for $100, and a lot of people saw the opportunity to be like, hey, I'm already a hobbyist into this. I can get this awesome like grail species to keep and enjoy myself, but also I think I could make a buck doing this. And then a few years later, 2015-ish, 2016, the ban on new imports happened, and so now we have what we have, and captive breeding is more important than ever. And I've mentioned this on some of my other podcasts. I have no axe to grind against people who are trying to have a side hustle or a hobby business or anything. The reality is, as you found with your blue-tailed firebelly newts and with your firebelly toads, if you're keeping these animals well, even as a hobby level as pets, they can produce a couple hundred offspring, and you have to do something with them. So it's sort of a natural progression for a lot of people to turn a hobby into a little business.
Yeah, it's great. It's great, and it feels great to breed a bunch of animals when they sell. And then when you breed a bunch of animals and they don't sell, you quickly realize like, okay, this is not, I don't want to be in this situation again. And like, I teach at a community college, and that's my full-time job. I don't I don't have any need to like make money off of this. My wife had a business. She just recently decided it was too much work to be trying to do a business, and then she also worked a full-time job. And last year, last year, going into the taxes from this year into April, I made a lot of money. Like, and I didn't do it on purpose. I just bred my bumblebee toads, one group of those, and I bred some Cyanarus, and I just sold them. My policy on like selling animals is I just try to sell them at a point that I think would always be okay, whether they're really rare or they're not. So when I was selling bumblebee toads, I think even $50 is kind of high. I think that's an animal, in my opinion, that's a $30 animal. It's a good animal. It's a great pet. I think it's something that should be a first time pet owner's kind of pet, or like a first time maybe amphibian or reptile person. It's a good first one. They're very hardy. They're easier than dart frogs, but they kind of look like dart frogs. I like them. I don't think that they should be $5, but I also don't think that they should be $150. I think that it's probably a $30 to $50 animal. And so I try to sell at the price that I think they would always be worth, or somewhere around that. Part of that is I don't want to ever give myself the illusion that breeding animals is a good long-term viable way to make all of my money. Because what ends up happening is, let's say I have Cyanarus is actually a great example of this. When I got mine, I bought them for $100. Then I bred them, and they just bred and bred and bred, and I was pretty good at keeping them alive. Um, so I sold them all, and I pretty much sold them for about $30 to $40 a piece. And I sold them mostly on Morph Market, but also at the reptile show. So I probably sold about 80 of them at the reptile show, or maybe a little bit less than that. And then I sold the rest of them through Morph Market. And I flooded the market with Sayanaris. I mean, I'm sure I had a significant impact on how many were out there. And that was just from that one time, and then I kept breeding them later on for the next 5 years. If you go online and you look at all the newts on Morph Market right now, what you're going to find is that Sayanaris go for about $30. Maybe even people are trying to get rid of them for less than that sometimes. And so whenever you breed an animal and you sell it, you are creating the situation that's going to cause you to not be able to sell those again in the future. And if you sell them for a really high price, so let's say I sell bumblebee toads, I sell them for $150 a piece. Guess what? Everybody who buys a $150 bumblebee toad is thinking, I'm going to sell these toads and make some money back. And so nobody that is just looking for a pet is trying to buy a $150 bumblebee toad. Typically, they're thinking, I'm going to breed these things. And in fact, I got some oak toads a while back, and my wife had said, no more animal. Like, she's like, you have enough, like, don't buy any more. And I secretly bought these oak toads, and I bought 6 of them. And she's been doing this so long with me that she knew that 6 animals means that I'm trying to breed these animals at some point. She like had put that together, and she was like, wait a second. So I think if you sell at $150, it does 2 things. One is it incentivizes people to also buy them, to breed them and sell them. And then also it gives you the illusion that you're going to be able to keep selling these animals for $150 forever. And you're not going to be able to. I go when I had my firebelly toads, I went to the reptile show, and I sold them for $20 a piece at the reptile show because everybody around me was selling them for $40 a piece. So Josh's Frogs was there selling them for $40 a piece, and a bunch of other people. And I was like, I have 100 of these right now that I need to have go to new homes, or I'm going to keep buying 2,000 crickets a week. And so I just was like, I'm going to sell these at $20 a piece until I move a significant amount of them. And that happened because that's like, especially with amphibians, that's the nature of their breeding cycle typically. Dart frogs, it's a little different because they just lay a few eggs and then they breed kind of. But with some of these like explosive breeders like toads and newts, you're just going to end up with a ton of animals, and whoever buys them from you is too. And then you're going to be in a situation. And then at some point, before you realize it, you're going to have 100 toads that nobody's buying because the market's saturated, and that other people are breeding and trying to sell as well. So I try to just be really careful. And like, I bred my bumblebee toads this year, and I just got 60 little toadlets that I'm taking care of, because the first time I bred my bumblebee toads, I had 100 and I think 180. And sure, from breeding them that like the springtail thing is insane with
Yeah.
180 bumblebee toads. It's just I couldn't keep up with it. I actually had to reach out to a guy on eBay who was selling springtail cultures, and I had to buy like 25 cultures. And I was like, hey, I sent him a private message. I was like, and maybe I hope he watches these because I don't remember who it was, but I hope he remembers this and then he reaches out to me or something. But I was like, hey, I messed up. Like, I bred these bumblebee toads. I thought some of these eggs weren't going to make it, and they made it. And then the tadpoles made it. And now I have the froglets, and they don't need anything except for springtails. And I only have like 20 cultures. And I was like, I'll pay you whatever, but can you try to pack these springtail cultures in? And they sent me these springtail cultures that had like a layer of spring. I don't even know how springtails survive, how thick they had put them in there. And that's what
Nice.
got me through that first batch. And that only worked because there's a woman named Laura Abraham. Do you know who she is?
Nope.
She breeds bumblebee toads. She's who I got mine from. And when the tadpoles were starting to come out, I was like, is there anything I can do about this? Like, I don't think I have enough springtail cultures. And she was like, no, you just have to have springtail. She said that when she first bred them her first time, she had like, it was a pretty high mortality rate. I can't remember I think it was like 70% of the toadlets she got didn't make it to adulthood. And it's
Yeah.
because she wasn't prepared for the springtail thing. And so I ended up getting all those toads through as well. this most recent time I didn't have as good a luck. So I had I had 500 eggs get laid, but I knew a lot of them were bad when they came out because they turned white.
Yep.
I don't know if you know that.
Oh, I've seen that. Yeah.
And then yeah, and then out of those there were 250 tadpoles, but a lot of them just didn't look right. And then out of those tadpoles, only 60 turned into frogs. So whatever happened this round, I could tell that there was just something off. I didn't brewmate my toads
I was
before.
about to ask, when did you brewmate them, and how late in the season was that spawn?
I didn't.
Yeah, that's why.
Yeah, it was midsummer. It was midsummer, and I didn't brewmate them. And I usually do. Like most years, I'll put them in. Most years, what I'll do is I'll actually have them go in the garage right now in September, October, and then leave them in there until like November. Pull them back out, and then I'll put a heat lamp on their enclosure on one side of it, and then mist like 4 times a day, and then that usually I get a good amount of healthy eggs out of that. But
Yeah.
I could just tell right off the bat this one wasn't going to pan out, and I tracked it to see how many I went down to so I could be like, okay, this is how big of a failed kind of situation it was to try to do it this way. But again, I didn't want to have 500 toadlets. So, you know, when the eggs were laid, I was counting on a bunch of them not making it, but if they had made it, I would have been in real trouble probably. I have 48 springtail cultures, but it's not quite enough for 500 toadlets if they had to all come out.
Yeah, I have a couple thoughts. This is really fascinating, this whole market and breeding aspect of the hobby. I definitely second your advice to really be, if you're listening out there and you're considering a new species of animal to keep with the intention of breeding it, I'm all for it. I want to fully support you and tell you to go for it. But really search your own motivations and think to yourself, how my desire to breed this and make money, how high up is that motivation? Is that like the primary motivation? If I fail at breeding this species, am I still going to enjoy keeping it? Because I see in myself, in the years I've been in the hobby, I recognize this in myself, and I see it a lot in other people, that motivation probably weighs pretty high on people. And then when they fail, they lose interest in the animal and move it on. Or they have success one time, like you mentioned, they have success one time, they realize the math isn't mathing. You know, on paper, I was going to get rich. But after I had to order emergency batches of springtails and raise 200 fire-bellied toads on, 1/8-inch crickets, by the time I spent money on crickets and built a website and paid for marketing and bought shipping supplies, and PayPal takes 7%. At the end of a whole year of doing that, they realized they really did not make a profit at all. And that was a lot of work.
Yeah.
And it wasn't worth it at all. So it's things for people to think seriously about before they go down the road of breeding amphibians, because you don't want, I'm sort of two minds. You don't want the enjoyment of keeping these animals really, really well, having a really good captive life, to be based on the success of breeding. Like, your animals are only going to thrive if you can make money off of them. But then at the same time, I've seen the market for a lot of different animals ebb and flow over the years. Things have been popular some years, and then they all seem to disappear if no one's working with them. And I don't know why that bothers me so much, that an animal is no longer available in the hobby, but it kind of does. With bumblebee toads, for example, if those completely disappeared from the hobby, that'd be a shame, because they are such a cool little animal that a lot of people can enjoy. And I also wouldn't want to see them collected by the thousands in the wild anymore, when we know they can be captive bred. I use red-eyed tree frogs as an example for this. I really don't think red-eyed tree frogs should be taken from the wild, except to just be put into the hands of a few breeders, maybe, because it's such an easy species to breed. I think it's sort of the hobby's responsibility to then meet the demand in the hobby with captive bred supply. Your comments about prices, I like your philosophy to sort of not chase after the top dollar on everything. And I think you learned that lesson from what I heard you say, because of the reality of marketing. If you don't have a ton of marketing sources to move the animals, then you have to price accordingly. And I've noticed, since taking an interest in dart frogs again, really, really common dart frog species are more expensive today than they were 10 years ago. And I just don't know if it's supply again, if it's a supply and demand thing, that there's way more demand than supply.
Yeah, I think with dart frogs, what's interesting and maybe a little bit different is that they're a slow breeding animal. So even though a lot of people have them, they're just a pair of dart frogs might be making, I don't even know. I don't keep dart frogs,
Yeah.
but they're making 10 more dart frogs a year, maybe max, right?
Sure.
And so it means that there's always kind of a pretty even supply and demand situation as long as the hobby's growing a little bit. Whereas like the problem with like bumblebee toads is if you breed them, so like my first year I bred bumblebee toads, the same as you're saying, like people reaching out and asking about newts and saying like, do you have any newts? My wait list for bumblebee toads when I first bred them was like 70 people long. It was
Yeah.
insane. Like I could have sold bumblebee toads all day long. And then people see them somewhere, they look cool, they're kind of a fun animal. What I like about them is that you don't feel bad keeping them because they move kind of slow, they just like crawl around on stuff. So if you have them in an 18 by 18, you feel ethically kind of okay
Yeah.
about keeping them. Whereas like if you keep a firebelly toad, I had firebelly toads and they were in 24 by 24 by 18 exoterras with like a half water, half land kind of situation. And I still felt kind of bad because they hop. And so when they'd hop, they'd get all the way across the enclosure in a hop or two. And then you're like, well, this doesn't really feel like enough space for them. So I really like bumblebee toads
Yep.
for that. But when people see them, they go, oh, I like that species. Let me reach out to this guy and get them. And then you don't have them for a year. And then you get them. You get a huge batch of them because they breed all this at once. You reach out to all those people. Maybe 1 out of 10 of them still wants them or wasn't able to find them somewhere else. And then so you're having some trouble getting them out there like that. And then by the time you sell them all off again, it's like that cycle kind of starts again. And so I think like the cycle is different with different animals, and that's probably why dart frogs are a little bit more stable in how the prices haven't gone dramatically up or down. Obviously, there's some locales and stuff that are super expensive, and then some that you can get for $10 or whatever. But
Yeah.
for the most part, they're kind of stable.
Yeah, and then the other thing about prices and the market, I do think, you mentioned like it's okay as a breeder to move your animals by lowering the price. I agree. There's definitely sort of like a bottom end of that price though, because like you said, you need to at least break even on your cricket.
Well, and you don't want to
bill.
You don't want to make enemies. So like when I went to that reptile show, it was me, Josh's Frogs, and one other vendor that had firebelly toads at that show. Josh's Frogs is going to be fine. They don't care. They had 2 pairs of firebelly toads and then all the other stuff they were bringing to the table. But I don't know. Maybe that other person was trying to sell their firebelly toads. I don't know what their price was, but they were trying to sell a couple pairs of them for, $100 or something, whatever they were trying to do. And I might have screwed them over, and they might even today look back, and if somebody mentions my name, they're like, oh, that guy selling them for $20 a piece. They might not like that. And that happens. I think where you see people get really angry about that is like people who are into breeding like crested geckos and things like that. If they go to a show, and I'm not like a big fan of ball python crested gecko breeding, but if they go to a show, they've put in a lot of money to breed their animals, they're trying to sell them for $500, and then somebody comes along and is selling crested geckos for $30 a piece, it's going to really mess up their ability to make any sales that day. And so I don't want to make enemies, and part of me choosing a middle pricing ground is that I make a lot more friends that way. Like, when I don't think I've ever had somebody feel like I ripped them off or I didn't give them a good deal or whatever it is. And then there's a lot of people I just make trades with. And, when I got my Tyler Triton, I traded bumblebee toads for those, my first group of them. And I had actually reached out to a few different people. I had said, hey, do you want to trade bumblebee toads for Tyler Triton? We could do, I was willing to kind of, Tyler Triton usually was selling like $150 a piece, and bumblebee toads were selling like $120 or $100 a piece or something. And I had said, do you want to trade? Like, I'll do, however many. And the first person I reached out to was like, well, you're selling your bumblebee toads for $50 a piece. So that's how much they're worth to me. And I was like, all right, never mind. And I just, because I was selling mine for cheaper,
Right.
they felt like because they decided to sell their Tyler to Triton for $200 or whatever they were selling for, it wasn't an even trade. And then I reached out to another guy out in New Jersey, and I was like, hey, I see that you have these, like, would you want to trade? And he's like, actually, they're my friends, but let me ask them. And then we just did a straight trade, and we didn't even know each other. He wasn't on Morph Market. I just sent some stranger 6 bumblebee toads, and then just hoped that some stranger that I had messaged on, I think it was on Fauna Classifieds, was going to send me back some Talich Triton. And then they did. And so then it's kind of a friendship at that point, because you had to trust each other, and then you both followed through and all of that stuff. And it's the same thing. Like, I feel like when you sell an animal for like an okay price, it doesn't feel just like a business transaction. It feels like this is like another person who is interested in the hobby. And if I have something cool, I hope to kind of get this back to him at some point. And so a lot of what I'm trying to do is that part of it. I was talking about making money in the hobby and like how that can be a problem. So I think I made like $6,000 through PayPal last year or something, just not even thinking about it. And PayPal sends you a thing, a
Yep.
1099 that says this is how much money you pulled in. And so I had to go back in my bank account and look at all the money I'd spent on the hobby. So I had to look at all the times I'd purchased things and crickets and whatever else I had purchased that had to do with amphibians and fish and reptiles. And I had spent like $4,000, $5,000, something crazy like that at the
Yeah.
end of it. And then I had to pay $2,000 in taxes. Like, there was no money made off of all of that. Now, if I scaled up, I'm sure I could make some money off of it, especially because once you buy materials, if you buy a 40-gallon tank, you can use that 40-gallon tank every year to do whatever. Once you buy Tyler to Triton, you have them. Now everything that comes out of them is profit. But I just think it's really hard to actually make money off of it unless you're really good at scaling. And then you hear everybody who does it, everybody who turns breeding into their career, they don't really enjoy keeping animals that much anymore.
Yeah.
Some of them maybe do a little bit, but it turns into a job, and then you're not having as much fun with it. So yeah, I try to just be really careful, but like you said, like the bottoms, you have to be careful about the bottom. You also don't want to return to, $5 firebelly toads at Petco. Like, you don't want
Right.
to return to that side either. So you want to price them high enough that there's a value to them, to the person who bought them, but low enough that it's not just another breeder that's trying to buy them to breed them. Not that that can't ever be the case. When I buy some stuff, I'm like, yeah, I want to try to breed this a little bit, but I promise I'm gonna always sell the animals I bought. I'm gonna always sell the animals that come from the animals I bought for much less than I bought them for. I've never had an animal that I've tried to sell for the same price that I bought them for. And I mean, I think part of that supply and demand just forces your hand to do that, but I also just feel like it's sort of the right thing to do. So
Yeah, it makes
I don't know.
sense. Otherwise it becomes a little bit pyramid schemy if we're all colluding with each other to keep the price high or something. Yeah, a little bit of my thoughts on the blue-tail firebelly newt market specifically. A few years ago, I had over 200 juveniles, and so I was thinking to myself, how am I gonna move these? And it really appealed to me at the time because I was not very active on social media. I didn't have any online marketing. It appealed to me that year to just wholesale them. I was like, I wouldn't mind just moving these all in one go to a wholesaler. And so I reached out to some of the Florida fish farms that were the companies that used to bring these in wild collected. And
Yeah.
I tried to explain to them, these, like, your company used to carry and sell these. You have a SKU number for them to move them into the supply chain. These ones, however, are captive bred, not wild collected, and so I expect a certain price for them. Is this something you're interested in? I have 200 of them. And a bunch of companies ignored me, but two companies got back to me and really, really lowballed me, like $3 or $4 per animal. And I was like, okay, I know I said I wanted to wholesale these, but now I'm having second thoughts because
Yeah.
I just felt like that that didn't respect the work that got put into captive breeding these animals. Profit motive aside, like you said, when there is a certain price tag associated with an animal, no matter what, we're treating it like a commodity. But when there's a more significant value than $4, you approach the animal with a different mentality. The consumer who's going to buy that, it's not like a goldfish that you're going to stick in a bowl and have it die in a week because it was a 50-cent animal. It was a feeder goldfish or something. So there's a certain price. So I didn't end up going that wholesale route. I bit the bullet and started teaching myself how to sell the animals online, and have been doing that since. However, I have had over the years different sort of like mom and pop pet stores, not chain pet stores, reach out to me and say, hey, would you wholesale a group of like 20 or 25 newts to us? Because boy, our customers really want them. And again, that has worked out really well. And I really like those relationships because I can talk on the phone with the person I'm selling it to. It's not like a big faceless, nameless entity that I'm wholesaling to. And I can make sure that they know the care parameters. All the pet stores I've dealt with seem to be run by really passionate, knowledgeable people. And they're putting those newts in front of customers who are not on Morph Market. They're not on Instagram, but there's still people who are walking through the mostly fish stores.
Yeah.
And encountering Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm terrible at this.
That's all right.
When the other part of it is if you build a little bit of a relationship with some of those stores, like I've sold a lot of firebelly toads and some newts to some of the local shops around here. And then some of the employees at those stores get to know you. So maybe, I only sold 10, 15 firebelly toads to this person, but then guess what? Every time a customer came in to ask about firebelly toads and they didn't have any, that employee would say, oh yeah, you should follow this guy on Instagram. He just lives around here and he always has them. So I got a lot of people that reached out to me later just through them referring them to me that bought other things from me later on. And so, I think it can be worth it to have that kind of situation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like you said, I think those blue-tail firebelly newts probably are one of the absolute best newt species to keep. They're hardy, they're mostly aquatic, they're beautiful, they're interesting, so they're really attractive. And like when I think to myself, like I remember hearing a podcast on the reptile side of things, and it was someone who's been in the hobby a real long time, and they were just sharing the numbers when they got like the original contract with Petco to sell crested geckos and bearded dragons, and you're talking about thousands a week, or 500 a week, to supply every single chain pet store with just 2 or 3 on the shelf all day, every day, no matter what. The same could be true for firebelly newts, because when they were coming in wild collected, that was the reality, that every chain pet store had them on the shelf year round. Basically, they never went out of stock.
Yeah.
And so there is potential for someone who's very industrious and wants to supply the market. I don't know. I don't know that it's possible to scale up 2,000 baby newts at wholesale prices and still have any time left in the day because of the live food issue that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah. One, bumblebee toads are even bigger problem because the hard part about bumblebee toads is the springtail problem. So I think that they would make a great pet store kind of thing. Like they don't have to keep them as humid. They can just keep them and I tried to bring them to the different pet stores, but they're too much of a unique sort of niche that I can't get people to be like, okay, we'll try to sell some of these, especially not if they're trying to sell, if I'm trying to sell them to them for $30 and they're trying to sell them for $80, are they going to have any customers that come in to buy them for $80? Probably not. And so what you would have to do to make bumblebee toads work is you would have to be able to raise them up at about, I don't know, it would have to cost almost full size, and you would have to be raising them up for under $5 so that you could sell them wholesale for $15 or something to make a profit. At the end of the day, I think it'd just be really hard to make it work like that. And that's probably why everything was wild caught, because in the wild, there's a lot of tiny little creatures for them to eat. Their bumblebee toads, I think, are having a very similar situation to Daphnia, in that Daphnia the way Daphnia populations work, you have a lake and the lake is cold. And when the lake is cold, all the plants and stuff have died and have sunk down to the bottom in the winter. And then when it starts warming up and the rain starts coming in, the water starts mixing up and the sun is shining all the time. And so you get this bloom of algae and bacteria and all this stuff. And the Daphnia are the first ones to take advantage of that and start eating up all of that bacteria and all of that algae and all of that stuff. And then right after that, the fish come in and they lay their eggs, and then the fish babies are eating all the Daphnia, and that's how that cycle works. Bumblebee toads, I think, are having the same thing, probably. I don't know. I haven't been to Argentina to see if this is true, but they're laying their tadpoles, and then as everything warms up, springtail populations and little tiny bugs and stuff in the spring are really heavy because all of that dead and decaying plant material from overwinter is just now getting broken down because everything's heating up. And then the baby bumblebee toads are growing with that food supply. To do that artificially, I think is really hard. I think it's really hard to create that. And that's why if you go on to like different Facebook pages or whatever about culturing Daphnia, you'll see people have a lot of trouble culturing Daphnia. Not a lot, but people are always like, what am I doing wrong here? The real problem with Daphnia is that they're designed to be cyclically explosive and then fall down to nothing, explosive and then fall down to nothing. And so a lot of times what's happening is they are just doing exactly what they're supposed to do. I mean, that's why Daphnia populations get too big and the food becomes too scarce. They lay their little, I think they're called amphibia eggs things. It's because they're designed to basically like just explode and then disappear, and then the next year they come back, or when the conditions get right, they come back. And so, yeah, I think trying to monetize that really first part of the life cycle is hard. When you get to bigger animals, you can feed them bigger things, and it's easier to try to find a way to turn that into a scalable giant thing. Like firebelly toads would actually be pretty easy, I think, to make work because there's already a cricket industry. And so you could have a warehouse with 100,000 firebelly toads and be just like throwing massive amounts of crickets at them and raising them up. But there's a lot of species I think that will never work like that again.
Yeah.
Because they won't be wild caught, and they'd be too hard to try to industrialize or like turn into.
Yeah,
something like that.
I have no problem with many amphibian species staying sort of hobby species, not pet store species, because then there's a little bit, it's not gatekeeping, but there's a little bit of a barrier to entry into keeping them, in that you have to research what they are, where they are, how to find them. And then you're probably going to be buying directly from a breeder, a hobbyist breeder. And I mean, that's how the dart frog hobby was for decades when I came up in it. I thought that was like, man, I was so proud to be a dart frog keeper rather than like a bearded dragon keeper back in like the late 90s, because it was community based. I learned everything. I learned, yes, off the internet and the forums, but by driving a few hours to some other dart frog nerd's house and seeing his basement full of stuff and him just sort of like mentoring me, you know. And there's a lot of stories like that of being mentored by other people in the amphibian or reptile hobby. And I think that's a really good part of it. It's that sort of community aspect of the hobby. And so if bumblebee toads are only ever available breeder direct from people like you and I, that's fine. And we'll do our best to supply it. Yeah.
Well, I think, you know, the thing that like dart frogs, toads, newts, and fish, they all have in common is like the hobby has changed, and maybe I wouldn't even say it has changed. So like fish keeping, people used to keep a fish tank with blue rocks and plastic plants and all of that stuff. And so there has been a shift there, but I think dart frogs have always kind of been this way. And then keeping toads and newts and fish and stuff has morphed into this. I think there's just a focus on creating a whole environment and not just having the animal for the sake of the animal. And you'll talk to some people who keep some of these animals, and they could have the animal die, and then they just keep having a terrarium in their living room that they're misting and that just has bugs and random stuff in it, because the point wasn't really just the animal. It was like this whole thing. And I think that that kind of also goes into the way that the culture is in all of these hobbies, which is like people aren't just trying to make the money off of the animal or aren't just trying to get some crazy animal. I mean, I look at some of the areas of reptile keeping when you get into like crocodiles and alligators and you get into like venomous species and stuff, and it's like some of those people, it's just the animal is the only, their goal is to get that animal and to have the animal, and like the rest of the parts of that aren't as, it almost feels a little bit like it's all of this hobby is all of keeping animals is selfish in a way. Like I'm not sure what kind of control issues we all have that cause us to do this sort of thing, but it's all sort of selfish, but it almost feels like it's a more immediately selfish or a more like just like there's no sense that you're going to ever have to have any reliance on anybody else. You just get to do exactly what you want to do and then that's it. I just think that amphibians and fish are a little bit different in that we don't have that sort of idea. We don't have the idea that like we just don't have to pay anything as far as ethically. We don't have, that we can just keep something any way we want to keep it, and that, we can try to take people for whatever we can get out of them. I just think there's more of a sense like, hey, I might run into this person later. I don't want them to think that I'm an idiot. I don't want them to think that I'm like a piece of garbage keeper. Like I want them to respect me later on, or like at least have like a sense that they think I'm an okay person. And I just think it's a little bit different for amphibians and fish and in that sort of way than some other hobbies, not even just thinking animals, but just some other hobbies. So I
Yeah,
don't know.
for sure. For sure. Interesting. Well, let me ask you a couple more questions about the species you keep, just because
Yeah.
just from
I
one
know we
keeper
barely
just
talk.
from I know that's fine. Just from one keeper to the next. I mean, I keep saying I don't want this podcast to just be like a verbal care sheet, but then like when you talk about a species, you do want to go over all the care sheet information of the species.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I'm just curious, the blue-tailed newts, cynops really like to eat eggs. And so as a breeder, I mean, you mentioned like you breed them now, you're not going after production numbers or anything, but how have you managed that in the past? Because I know with mine, if I don't collect in the breeding season, if I don't get in there and collect eggs every day or two, they eat so many eggs.
Yeah. So part of it is it's like chickens. I don't know if you've ever kept chickens, but once a chicken starts pecking eggs
Yep.
and starts ruining eggs, sometimes it's really hard to break that habit. And so the same thing, like if you keep your newts well fed, sometimes you can avoid some of that. So Daphnia, I think, are a good way to do that because it distracts them. They're like, oh, maybe they would have gone over and checked out an egg for 5 seconds, realized that it was food, and then eaten it, but something just floated by in front of them, and they're like, oh, I should go see what that's about.
Sure.
So I think that's one of the ways. The other thing is, I think the type of plants that they lay on makes a difference in how easy it is for them to eat eggs. So if you can get the Brazilian pennywort to grow, if you can get that, I really think that's the best plant species to have your newts lay eggs on. The thing is that's hard about it is pennywort grows really well at 80 degrees, and newts obviously don't do well at 80 degrees. And so the reason that worked for me when I did it the first time is I had pennywort growing in a 40-gallon stock tank out in my garage, and I had a heater in there. And then when I moved my newts out to that tank, or maybe I moved the pennywort into the garage, I can't remember. But when I moved one of them to the other, I just kept the temperature low and the pennywort did fine. It just didn't keep growing explosively. But if you can get pennywort to really take off and you can get that in your newt tank, it's going to make collecting eggs a lot easier because every folded leaf is an egg, and you just pinch that leaf off, and if you have enough, it's going to be fine. Those were big ways that I did that. But yeah, I don't know if there's a great way outside of what you said, which is just going in and collecting every day. And yeah, so if you're serious about trying to have a bunch of larvae, you're going to need to be going in there at least every other day or something and looking and trying to grab the eggs before they get taken out. If you try to, in my opinion, if you try to use like, oh, is it pronounced? I say Elodia, but it might be Elodia.
Yep.
What do you say?
Elodia.
Yeah, okay. So if you use that, I think your newts are going to get a lot of your eggs, but it works. People use it. Java moss works okay because it's just so thick that once they lay their eggs in it, the eggs can kind of hide, but it's really hard to get eggs out of Java moss. So
Yeah.
you end up taking whole clumps of it. And Java moss isn't cheap. I've had times when I've had, you know, 20-gallon tanks full to the top of Java moss, and then there's other times when I don't have almost any of it. And so Java moss is a hard one. When you want it to grow, it doesn't, and then when you don't care
I
about
don't
it, it
like
kind of
Java
takes
moss
off.
because it gets really funky because there's a lot of
Yeah.
waste and uneaten food and dead pieces of worms that the newts didn't eat, and the Java moss gets pretty funky pretty fast for me, so I don't use Java moss.
Yep. Yeah, especially in newt tanks where you don't have a lot of flow. But if you put Java moss in like an aquarium that you have fish in
Yeah.
and you have a decent amount of flow on it, it'll stay pretty clean. But
Gotcha.
yeah, it's hard. And then it gets like algae issues and stuff like that too. I saw somebody who talked about Java moss once, and they said like, if you want Java moss to grow, what you have to do is not move it in any significant way. And then once it gets growing, it will keep growing, but every chunk you move to somewhere else will not do as good as that parent plant that you're growing. Like it just gets very used to light coming in at a certain space and a certain temperature requirement and stuff. And I think that ends up being true.
Gotcha.
But
Gotcha. Substrate in your aquatic newt setups, like your blue-tailed firebelly newt setups, what do you like for substrate, if any?
I use gravel, and I know people are not going to love that. Some people are not going to love that. Coming from the fish keeping side. So whenever I think about like care of an amphibian, I think like overall, what's the best thing that you can do here? And so, yes, do I think that it's possible that a newt is going to go down and pick up a piece of gravel, eat it, and then it's going to cause it to die? I think that that's possible for sure. I don't, I wouldn't argue against that. I will say that, in my adult newts that I've had, I've only lost maybe 2 adult newts or 3 adult newts. And I think that if that was a bigger problem, it would just, probably had, I mean, off and on, I've probably had 30 adult blue-tail newts. And I just think it would be a bigger problem. I've never seen a newt grab a piece of gravel when they're eating and not spit it out. I've seen newts grab something that they didn't like and then they just kind of poof it back out of their mouth. They just kind of spit it back out. Now, the benefits of gravel coming from the fish keeping side, I was talking at the beginning about beneficial bacteria. Beneficial bacteria grow on the surface of things in your aquarium. And so the more surface area you have in your aquarium, the more beneficial bacteria you have. So that means like, let's say your newt poops in the water or like you have some sort of food that just gets in the water. You've got more of these little bacteria to eat up whatever that is in the tank and to make it so that that tank doesn't have problems with nitrate and nitrates. And so that's one big part of it. And then another big part of it for me is it becomes a waste sink in that if you don't have anything anywhere for waste to go, it just stays on the bottom. And that's why if you have a bare bottom tank, and I also have bare bottom tanks, so not all of my tanks have like gravel in them, but my tanks that I want people to see always have gravel in them. But in my tanks that are like I have a tank in the garage that just is bare bottom that I just have a ton of Elodia in or Elodia in, and I don't have anything on there, but there's like this much layer of stuff on the bottom. And that mulm can also be a place where beneficial bacteria can go, but I just think it's a lot harder. Like if I put food in the tank and it sinks down into that, then the newts are like going down into this layer of like poop and like decomposing stuff to try to get the food.
Right.
And maybe that's good, maybe it's not. I don't know, but when you have gravel in there, there's a sink for all of that stuff to go in. And then what that also allows is if you want to have a planted tank, it allows your plants to root into that gravel and pull out some of those nutrients. So I like gravel tanks more.
Does aquarium sand work the same as gravel as far as surface area for beneficial bacteria, or because it's so tightly compacted together?
It doesn't work the same. The tightly compact doesn't. It turns it anaerobic, so it just makes it so that there's no oxygen getting to anything.
Okay.
And so like if you ever have a planted aquarium, freshwater tank, and you use sand, there's a limited number of plants that you can put in that. They have to have the kind of roots that don't require the sand to be what they're getting their nutrients out of. So jungle val is like that long grass kind of plant that sometimes people have in their aquariums. That'll live in sand. And the reason it lives isn't because it will root a little bit, but the main reason that it does okay is because some of its roots are above the sand, the roots that need to have some oxygen in them. And so, yeah, you can't have plants quite the same way, and you you're not getting as much oxygen into the roots of those plants, and you're not getting oxygen into the bacteria that need that oxygen to continue to work the way that they're working. Again, like I always tell people, this isn't like a hill I'll die on. So if people are like, "Oh, gravel's evil," I don't like make a big thing out of it, and I'll keep newts in both ways. I just don't tend to think it's as big of a problem as people think it is, just because of the number of newts I've raised and had them on gravel and not seen problems with that. I'll also say that I think that so axolotls are a little bit different, and this is when you say like newt keepers are one thing, axolotls are like this other thing. Axolotl keepers are very serious about not having gravel in the tanks. And I'll say I don't know enough about them to say anything otherwise. They have different mouth structures. They kind of like are like bass, they gulp things in, and it probably is different. But I did see, I forget where I saw this, so I probably shouldn't be referencing it, but there was a woman who was a scientist who was talking about it, and she thinks that sometimes in the wild, amphibians are swallowing stones on purpose, like alligators do and things like that. And so she said what her argument was is nobody's ever created a correlation, or nobody's ever shown a causation between finding stones in an axolotl's stomach and that being the reason the axolotl died. So she says everyone assumes like your axolotl died, you don't know why they died, cut them open, you find a rock in there and you go, oh, that must be what killed them. But they might have had that rock in their stomach for the last 5 years. Like there's nobody's ever done the research to go, this is why that axolotl died. And so I think it's just one of those things. Like I think sometimes people are, for good reason, like you want to care for animals the best way you can. You don't want to do stuff in a captive animal that are like harming it or anything like that. But at the same time, I think sometimes people are afraid to try other things that might end up being the way that things should be. I think about my tortoise in that way a lot. Like when people first started making like tortoise groups on Facebook and stuff, you would go on there and people would talk about leaving their tortoise out to hibernate in the winter, and people would be like, you're going to kill your tortoise, because they don't know like that is actually part of what that tortoise needs. And it's just like people are trying to be too careful. And so I don't know.
Interesting.
That's how I feel about gravel.
Yeah.
What do you do for gravel?
Thanks. Mostly bare bottom.
Yeah.
The reason why I'm so interested in it is because every time I sell a newt, I point people to a care sheet I wrote on Frograck.com. And of course, substrate is a pretty big question. My main concern wasn't ingesting gravel, it's water quality. And while I hear you say that having gravel provides a good buffer for water quality because of all the beneficial bacteria, I think people overfeed. And so if you're using non-live foods like pellets, axolotl pellets, or frozen brine shrimp, or frozen bloodworms, or Hikari fiber bites, those are all sinking foods, and they're not live foods. And so almost immediately when that stuff hits large-sized pea gravel, some of it is going to get into the gravel and be completely inaccessible for the newts to find and eat. And so right there from the get-go, you're already fouling your water with uneaten food. Whereas a bare bottom tank, the advice I always give people, because they ask how much to feed, but that's dependent on temperature, how big the newt is, how many newts are in the tank. I always say you really don't want food left over at the end of the day. And if you see food left over at the end of the day, let's assume you're feeding like frozen bloodworms or something, remove it. Don't let that food stay in there overnight. And so having a bare bottom and a turkey baster helps with that. And then if there was significant food left over at the end of the day, skip a day and or feed less. So that's been sort of like why I've taken the route of not just using bare bottom myself, but promoting it is solely to help new newt keepers get used to feeding not live foods.
Yeah. So let me I guess where maybe we're coming at it from different places is I'm not even trying to use gravel so I think sometimes, like if you were to think about axolotls, I think you're completely right. Like anyone who puts gravel in with axolotls is going to be trying to put stuff in that's not gravel. It's big enough that the axolotl can't swallow it. I'm not really worrying about that. And so my gravel, I actually use a small gravel size so that like a bloodworm wouldn't sink down into that gravel. Now,
Okay.
what most people would be afraid of with that is they would go, if you use a gravel size that small, your newt's going to eat that gravel and then it's going to get stuck in there.
Gotcha.
And that's where I just don't, I don't worry about it. And I haven't seen it be a problem. I've had other problems. I have had newts. So two of my Sayanaris that I've had in the last like 5 years or so stopped eating suddenly. Now, is there a possibility that the reason that they stopped eating was because they were blocked up because they ate some sort of gravel or something like that? It's possible. I can't say for sure, but I will say that like my water quality in my tanks is good and like it always is clear. I never have problems with like big die-offs or anything, and it just is coming from the fish side that I came to that conclusion about gravel. I mean, I had the same thing happen with Tylotriton. Two of my Tylotriton just stopped eating and died suddenly. And I actually posted about this recently on one of the new pages. I had another Tylotriton that did that. And then I started supplementing it with calcium gluburonate, which is used to be an over-the-counter thing, but I think it's harder to find now. And this newt that I saw this happening to, it's the same thing that was happening. It's the same way of the blue tail newts that I had that died. They're still trying to eat. They're going up to food and like kind of like trying to do it, but it's almost like their mouth just won't open. And my Tylich Triton were the same way. Like if, I have them here, I'm going to show you guys. So if I like open this thing up, these things want to eat. They want to be my friend. They're going to start climbing up onto this thing like right away. Here, I'll just keep talking while I'm doing this. But so it's not like that they feel bad. They're coming over, they're trying to eat, but it just was like it couldn't open its mouth. And so I started just giving it just a little bit of calcium gluburonate. And I did that for about a month. And then that newt is completely 100% back to normal. And so I don't think that what was causing my Sayanaris problems had to do with, well, he's here, but I think they don't know because usually I'm up here doing it. But he doesn't know what he's doing. But I think that's the problem that aquatic newts sometimes have is like when newts are small, I'm feeding them Daphnia, I'm feeding them things like that when they're aquatic. Oh, there's one. Do you see him?
Yep.
No, he fell back down. But when they're small, they're getting their calcium from all the stuff outside, and they're getting like, if I'm feeding, let's say I'm feeding like mosquito larvae and things like that, the sun's shining, there's all sorts of nutrients I'm sure that are going into those bugs. But then when I am feeding inside the house, I'm moving towards things like, and as the newts get bigger, I'm moving towards things like earthworms, and I'm moving towards things like frozen bloodworms and stuff like that. I think actually that's what's happening is aquatic newts sometimes aren't having that time of their life where they're like above ground and they're eating like little bugs and insects that have a lot of calcium in them, and so then they're getting a calcium deficiency. I don't know for sure because I've only had it happen to a few newts, but I do know that it looked the same between the two species, how they were behaving. And one animal, getting this animal back to healthy using that calcium gluburonate, I don't, that's a terrible sample size. I recognize that that's not like whatever, but when I posted that online, I think I got like 350 likes immediately on the post saying what I had done. And I had like 15 people message me and say, my Tylotriton is doing the exact same thing. I'm having that exact same issue, and I'm going to try this and see what happens. And I think, while newts and toads and stuff don't need quite as much, you know, calcium, and maybe they don't need as much vitamin D, I think that they probably need more than some of us are giving them. And I don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
I know some people, there's different ideas on that, but on my terrestrial newt tanks now, I keep a UVB light, and it's a weak UVB light, and I keep it pretty high. But I just put it on there just because now I'm kind of nervous about that calcium deficiency as a problem. I mean, going from Sign-Up Sayonara's where I had so many breed and I didn't have any die, and then I got Tyler to Triton and I had 2 out of 8 animals die. Like there had to be something that's going on that I'm just not understanding, and so I'm trying to like get that, figure out what that is. And now I
Right on.
also, yeah, I feed
with
dusted
the
crickets
terrestrial,
too.
yeah, with the terrestrial Tritons, you can use lots of calcium and D3 powder on feeder insects, but you can't do that with aquatic species.
Yep. So yeah.
Daphnia, question for you. I'm pretty sure I understand this correctly. Daphnia have 2 modes of reproduction. They can give live birth and then they lay some sort of egg-like thing. Is that right?
Yep. And they prefer to just basically clone themselves. They make about 10 babies every week, and then the babies take about, I don't know, a week or 2 to grow up, and then they start making 10 babies a week. So you can get a lot of Daphnia very quickly. If the water quality switches for some reason, or there's some sort of stressor, so you could have a lack of food, you could have increased predators, something like that, they're going to lay these little, they just look like little rectangles, and then those fall down into the mud, and then they hatch out. I don't know if anybody knows exactly when they decide to hatch out, but they hatch out later and they create a new set of them.
So I've been collecting Daphnia to start my cultures locally right off my property where I have some vernal pools. So these are New England woodland vernal pools that definitely dry up every year. And it's awesome in the springtime. There's so many Daphnia, and every time I've tried to culture them indoors or outdoors, whether it's in like a 10-gallon tank, or I tried kiddie pools. I tried those 300-gallon IBC tote cubes. They never ever produce anything other than the little black rectangular cysts or eggs or whatever. So whatever I have locally is really predisposed to not bearing live young. But I've gotten
let me tell you,
I've gotten those little black triangles to reproduce. I just left them in a bucket of dead leaves outside year round. I put it somewhere where the bucket wouldn't stay full of water, so it dried out. And then I went out in February and just grabbed this at the bottom of a 5-gallon bucket. It was this big cookie of just pulverized dead leaves, frozen rock solid. I brought it in the house in February, put it in a 20-gallon tank, and sure enough, 4 weeks later, I had millions of Daphnia. So I've figured that out, but I can't.
Yeah, that's a way to do it.
One of those people that can't keep a Daphnia culture going for any amount of time.
So it's there's a lot of variables that make you successful or not successful with Daphnia. And that's one of the problems is you'll go online and you'll say hey, what should I do to keep these Daphnia? And then somebody will be like, well, just put them into 10-gallon tank and then have the light on for 16 hours. If the temperature is off, if the water has a little bit of chlorine, there's 50 variables that could make it work or not work. If maybe there's no calcium in your water, maybe there's salt in the water, so many things. But I will tell you, there's 2 ways that people do it that are pretty successful in other countries. One way, so they do this a lot in Thailand and stuff. They take a 20 or 40-gallon body of water, maybe a stock tank or something, but it's not a stock tank. It's whatever they have lying around. And they just take a scoop of cow poop, and they just put it in the water. They leave it for 2 days, and then they dump a net of Daphnia in there, and then the Daphnia reproduce. And they'll go back a week later, and there'll be millions of Daphnia in that thing. And part of the reason that it works is Daphnia eat both algae and bacteria and yeast. And so if you put something like poop into the water, then you're going to have algae growing from that, but you're also going to have bacteria and stuff coming out of there. And so the Daphnia are getting all these nutrients from different places. The other thing that people do, and I learned this, I took an aquaculture class at Oregon State University. What they do for if you were a big farm fish breeder, you were going to farm trout or something, they will they'll take a hole in the ground. So they'll have their ponds dug out, and then they'll plant grass seed. So they'll just plant so much grass seed in that pond, and then they fill that pond up with water, and they leave it for 2 weeks. The grass seed dies, and as it dies, little zooplankton are eating that dying vegetation, and that's how they get it to bloom. And so when you see these vernal pools, it's the same sort of thing happening where like the vernal pool has some plants and stuff growing up, and even if it doesn't, it has the dead stuff from the year before. It has the frogs that didn't make it. It has the mud and the
Yep, the
leaves and all
leaves.
of that stuff in there. Yep. And then when the weather starts warming up and the water goes in there, the zooplankton, which Daphne are a part of, start going crazy because there's bacteria, there's all this kind of stuff that they can eat. And so if you can imitate that, that's one way to do it. But the easiest way to do Daphnia, if you're just trying to get like a little culture on your own, is you just take a 10-gallon tank. I know everybody tells people this and then there's problems with it, but take a 10-gallon tank, you put a light on it 100% of the time. Don't have it go off at all. And that tank should be no hotter than like 75 and no colder than 65. And then feed yeast every day. And if you can feed 2 times a day yeast, small amount. Like don't if you feed too much, you're going to deplete all the oxygen in the water and they're going to all die. So you want to feed a couple times a day yeast and you will see those numbers grow. People try to do spirulina powder and all this other stuff. I have like 5 different ways that I keep Daphne. I keep some outside in tubs. I keep some in the greenhouse. I keep it in jars in a window. Like I do all sorts of stuff. And the most consistent is just to have that 10-gallon tank with a light on it all the time that I feed yeast. And the hard part is you just can't if you miss a day of feeding yeast, it's almost like you got to start over. Not they won't all die, but you just have to like it's almost like they're not going to give birth anymore. You got to build back up a week of feeding every day consistently before they're going to get ready to drop to have some more babies. So
Gotcha.
I think that ends with, but I know Daphnia are hard and people go nuts trying to do it, and I just somehow the Daphnia thing has really worked out for me. And white worms too. Like I used to have a lot of trouble with white worms, and then I got a wine cooler. Anyone who's trying to do white worms, just go and buy $100 little cheap wine cooler, and everything about your white worm culture is going to go easier. I would have it be where I'd have 2 times a year where my white worms would be booming and doing really well, and then in the summer they'd be almost dead, and then I'd have to spend all winter trying to get those numbers back up. But now with wine cooler, if I really want the numbers to be going crazy, I put it at 62. I feed cat food that I put through a coffee grinder, and then I have as much white worms as I could ever eat. Like I have so many white worms that I'm just like dumping them down the drain half the time. I'm dumping like large amounts of white worms down the drain because if I don't, the cultures will crash because
Yep.
there's just too many of
Yep.
them. So those I've had a lot of luck with. But I'm in the same spot as everyone else with blackworms. I mean, blackworms are a nightmare
Yep.
and expensive and
Yeah, I mean, I think I think live food is what's holding the newt hobby back from growth, or it's what's holding any hobbyist back from scaling up. Is live food. I have space. I don't know. I have half a mind to just rent an excavator for a weekend and build some more ponds in my forest. I have plenty of acreage and there's water. I don't know if I just want to build some more ponds, but then there's a biosecurity issue, constantly pulling Daphnia from essentially the wild and bringing them into. There's a biosecurity issue, and dragonfly larvae keep hitching a ride, or dragonfly eggs keep hitching a ride, and they become a predator real quick in a tank of baby newts. So yeah, there's no easy way around it.
yeah, that's the same.
No easy way around it. I'm curious about the emperor newts you have, the Tylotetrite and Shanjing. They're a really cool species. I think if people aren't familiar, hop on Instagram right now and find a couple reels of that species sort of lumbering around in their terrarium and coming out to feed and eat. Could you give us, a little bit of a care sheet rundown, like how they're different than other newts as far as care parameters go? And then more interestingly to me, tell me, what is it like having them as a captive? Like, what's the interaction and the care requirements from you, the hobby keeper of this newt?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess I should say first, I haven't bred them, so I do feel like until you've bred a newt or a toad, it's hard to say that you understand the whole cycle of what they're about. And so I haven't done that. I did try to when I first got them, and I had one that went down into the water, and then all the rest of them just sat on a piece of coconut bark or a piece of cork bark for the whole time. I had them in there for 3 days, and they never got off that cork bark.
Yeah.
And so then I felt bad, and I was like, I'm not going to keep trying to do this. So I haven't done that, but I guess I would say they're a really fun species. They're big compared to some other newts. Like they have some heft to them. And when you first get them, they're a little bit shy and they don't really want to come out, and you end up trying to feed them worms or whatever you're feeding them, and they'll kind of maybe try to grab one, but they're mostly trying to stay away from you. But once they have figured out, I would say like maybe the fifth or sixth time that you feed them by tongs, once they really figure out that you have the food, then they're really super interested in what you're doing. Like, honestly, I feel like, my tortoise is pretty interactive. Like, if he sees me, he wants to come over to me. He doesn't mind getting picked up. He doesn't have any, like, fear of anything. And I really feel like they're kind of like a lizard species in that way. Like, they come up, like, this is where we play cards on Friday nights. So we'll be sitting at this table playing cards, and all three newts will just be sitting on the edge of the thing here, just like watching us the whole time, just watching us play cards, like with their hands up on the glass, just like whatever. And if I open up the thing, I mean, it didn't really work when I was trying to show you guys a second ago, because usually when they really start going nuts, it's when I'm standing up above them. And so me sitting here, I think they don't realize that they can try to get out. But when I'm feeding them and I open those doors, they're I have to take one, put it in the back to feed the other, take one, put it in the back to feed the other, because they're literally just trying to come up and like be on there, and they'll walk right onto my hand, like whatever. I'm not like I like fish and things that you don't really handle. Like, I'm not like somebody that wanted reptiles to handle them, but these things, like, they really seem like they want to like get on your hand and just sit there and hang out and like check things out. Like, they're a really cool species in that way. Feeding, what's really nice is once they get bigger, they can eat earthworms the size of the ones that you get for like fish bait. So, a big size earthworm, I'll cut that into like thirds and I'll feed a third to each one, and they can put that down pretty easy. Whereas some other newts never get to a size where that's like a good feeder. And then, yeah, you do crickets, and mostly they don't really like the crickets. When I feed them crickets, I have to trick them. So they'll eat anything out of my hand right off the bat. And then after they figure out what it is, then they decide if they want more of it. So if it's earthworms, they want more of it. But if it's crickets, they just eat the one. And so I'll take some crickets and I'll dust it with vitamin A and calcium. And then I get them come over, and then they grab it and they eat it. And then usually they won't take a second one after I do that. So I got to like make sure that they eat it once they grab it. Otherwise they eat it and then they kind of spit it out, and then they don't try to eat any more of it.
Yeah.
But even if I don't dust them, they still don't like it. They don't like crickets. They just aren't a fan.
Hey, little tangent about feeding terrestrial newts. Have you tried black soldier fly larvae? Because I think, in my mind, they have the highest potential for gut loading because they'll eat anything. But I have also heard from people that they're not easily digestible. So,
no, I haven't tried it. You know what I have tried that I heard you mention, I'm sure it was on your first podcast, which would have been probably a while ago, but I did try fruit fly larvae. Yep. I did the same thing that you were talking about, where like I just took a ton of Heidi and I just packed Heidi into this, and then they laid a bunch of eggs, and then once they all turned into larvae, so what I did was what you mentioned, which is like not the way to try to do it. I like took the whole culture and I dumped water in it, and then I dumped it through a net, and then I just kept clearing it. It was really a nice way to feed the Ensiccata popii. It was is that how I'm supposed to be saying that, popii?
That's how I would say it, yeah.
Yeah, okay. I just so you know, I teach English, so I'm humble about how to say things.
I mean, Latin is a dead language, so technically no one knows how to pronounce it. So who cares?
Yeah, that's true. But it was a real lifesaver for feeding the very small newts that had just morphed out. It was really great. But I'm going to try it the way that you were saying, where you don't put any media in there, and then you just, as they climb up the side of the container, you're just spooning them out. I think that's going to be a really great additional feeder. And I think even the Tyler to Triton will eat something like that.
Yeah.
If I give them blackworms, they'll really go after blackworms. It's just that it's hard to feed. They got big mouths. They're kind of a big animal. So blackworms, when I feed it to them, I almost have to, like, the way I've done it before is I've taken a plastic spoon and then just like put them on there and just like almost like spoon fed the newts, because it's hard to get them in there any other ways.
Yeah.
Yeah, but they're really, I mean, they're expensive. That's the hard part, is they're expensive. As far as like heat and lighting, I just keep them at room temperature. Our house is anywhere between like 67 and 72 all year long. And then I have a UVB light on there, and then I just have a regular LED light. This enclosure, I don't love the way it turned out. I wish that the light wasn't so bright so that it was better to see on here, but I just have some ferns in the background, and then I have moss on the bottom and the front, and then a little water dish. Some of my other tanks I do like this tank back here is a paludarium, but it's just I've separated out the front and the back with a piece of acrylic, and then the back part is built out just like most dart frog tanks with a false bottom and then some dirt and stuff like that. And then the front is just water, and then I have an aquatic floating plant called salvinia, and the salvinia just keeps the water from growing like algae and stuff in it. But I do the paludarium so that if the newts end up wanting to go into water eventually, they can. But with Tyler to Triton, they don't really need to have that aquatic phase, as far as I've researched. And there might be people who've kept them longer who say the opposite, but mine have been just all on land so far, and they seem to prefer that.
Nice.
Sometimes I'll catch one in the water dish, but not that often.
Yep. Nice. Yeah, I have marbled newts, Tridoris marmoratus, totally different genus from a different continent, but they very much, in my experience, don't want to stay aquatic. The juveniles don't want to stay aquatic, and you risk drowning if you try to force them to do it. And the adults, once breeding season is done and over with, they want to spend winter terrestrially. And so I enjoy keeping them, both the juveniles and the adults, terrestrially, and they are quite tame as well, hand feeding off of tongs, pieces of worms, and even non-live food. I mix up, turtle food like tetrareptamin or Pac-Man frog pellets. Like there's some company that makes a non-live food marketed towards Pac-Man frogs that you just hide.
It's Hikari.
Is it?
Hikari
Yep.
does that.
So I've gotten those before.
Yeah.
And the newts take those off of, I use a really small wooden like popsicle stick, but smaller, like a coffee stirrer, because I don't want anything sharp or metal or anything hurting them when they are trying to take a bite of it. But yeah, they'll tame right down to the point where they're eating non-live food off of a stick, which just, it's a different level of enjoying an animal. You know, having a good feeding response, having an animal that has a good feeding response, it just gives the keeper a different experience of husbandry versus a hands-off animal. If you were to compare, you know, here in North America, we have mole salamanders like tiger salamanders and spotted salamanders that sometimes people keep in captivity. And they're not quite the same as a terrestrial newt, like those Tylototritons you have. In their habits, they really want to be buried in the ground more. They can be tamed down and to take food as well. But these terrestrial newt species, I think, are really enjoyable, especially if you have a front opening terrarium. You know, because I remember when I was a kid, I was keeping like spotted salamanders in fish tanks, and the whole top down, trying to like interact with an animal top down. I think from the animal's perspective, they sense you at more like a predator response, and then from your perspective, you're not like looking at the animal head on, especially if you're trying to hand feed them. And so just the fact that front opening terrariums are so commonplace nowadays, again, it brings a level of enjoyment to keeping certain species that wasn't
and
always
it makes
there.
I feel like it makes it possible to make, I mean, my wife disagrees with this. She says all aquariums look ugly, but I think it's possible to make a front front open terrarium look better in a way that you're never going to achieve with an aquarium for a reptile, right? Because with
Yeah.
an aquarium for a reptile, you always have to have that access point on the top. Whereas like all of my, I built out all of these stands that I have for mine, and they match all of the other furniture that we have in our house. And I have just in this area, I have 3 terrariums, and then I have one in our entryway, but they all look, it just looks like a piece of furniture that happens to have a terrarium with like a bunch of greenery in it. Whereas like if you go into somebody's house and they just have only, I mean, it depends also, like it depends on what you're trying to do in your house and how the space is laid out, but I don't have a separate space like a frog room or something. Like everything I keep, I have to find a place in our actual living space to put this that is going to be reasonable when we have guests and stuff come over, that it doesn't look like some crazy thing. And I think that the front opening terrariums with the misters and all of that kind of stuff, it just can create a better feel than you can get away with. And I think it changes the longevity of the hobby. There's some weeks when I'm like not I'm busy, I have other stuff going on or whatever. And if I feel like if I just had an aquarium with an open top and there was like a snake in it or something, and it's just in the corner of my room, I might never go back to that. But when I have something like this and I'm like, I hear the mister go off and I see that the plants are growing in, maybe I go, oh, I should cut that plant back, or I should do something like this. I think it just keeps it's like I was saying before, it keeps it kind of like, it keeps you almost feeling like you build a culture around it, or like there's like a lifestyle that's associated with it that isn't really about the animal. It's about the whole thing. It's like all of the different parts of it. I mean, sometimes like what I want to do is I want to just like do stuff that has to do with the culturing of all the food stuff I have. Like I'm like, oh, I got to go do a water change on my Daphnia culture.
Right.
It's like that's like a side of a side of a side thing that's part of this hobby. And I think I think the front opening terrariums make the whole experience better in that sort of way, kind of like you're talking.
Yep. And then sort of getting towards the end of our conversation here, I'm just curious with most of your animals, so they're not in their own separate room, but all of them are either subtropical or temperate, which means that they can definitely handle seasonal changes. In fact, it's part of their natural history to experience seasonal changes. So like your bumblebee toads or your newts, what do they experience in the way you keep them as far as seasonal changing goes?
Yeah, so my bumblebee toads, I have 3 tanks of bumblebee toads. I have 2 in our bathroom and I have 1 in our entryway. And the one in our entryway, all those toads they're like 6 years old, I think, maybe 5 years old. Those, you know, it's pretty much the same all year round. There's a little bit of variance because the door's getting opened and closed all the time. So there's like a breeze coming in, and if it's 30 degrees outside, there's like a 30-degree breeze coming in, and then it's cooling down. I do also keep a very small heat lamp on that enclosure. It's a 24 by 24 high, and on one corner I put a little heat lamp, and that was just because what I noticed was when I was trying to get them ready for breeding, they would eat a lot more if they were a little bit warmer, and because they're in that entryway they don't get quite as warm. But my ones in the bathroom, they're just whatever temperature our bathroom is, and at night it drops down to like 66, 67, and then during the day it might get up to as high as like 74 on a hot summer day if there's sun shining through the window. There's no humidity except for the water that they get misted with. I mist twice a day for like 15 seconds. And then I plant heavily. I love, and I know other people hate, Ficus pumila. I love it. Like, I think Ficus pumila, I think it just, people start off with it. It looks awesome, and then it takes over. And people who have a lot of animals don't like dealing with cutting it back. But there's no plant that you're going to get that's going to create a better, like, fill in with small leaves. That's like that plant that doesn't require humidity. And so I love it. There's kind of a different amount of moisture that the toads can get on their own. I just recently really cut back my tank in my entryway. And I didn't realize, but the Ficus pumila had been losing leaves for the last like 4 years. And there's about this much leaf litter underneath all of the Ficus pumila that I had in there. And so there's a little bit variation in the heat that they can get a hold of, and there's a little bit difference in the amount of moisture that they can get. So yeah, that's kind of how I keep bumblebee toads. And I would say when I'm serious about breeding them and I like really want to make sure I'm going to get them to produce some good eggs, I take them out into the garage and I just have a little, it's like a 10-gallon, I forget what brand. I think it's a Zoomed tank. They're like 10 gallons, but they're split in half. And I put a bunch of moss in that. And then I just put them in there. I don't feed. I mist maybe once every 3 days, and I just leave them in the garage for a month and a half. And then I bring them back out, put them back in the enclosure, have the heat light that I have in that tank only comes on for about 2 hours a day, but if I'm trying to get them to breed, I'll have it come on for like 6 hours a day, and then the LED lights come on all day long, and then I'll mist like 4 times a day. And then after about 3 weeks of doing that, they're usually calling, and I know that they're ready to put into a rain chamber, which I don't really, my first time I did some crazy rain chamber where I'd created this bar that was like raining on them and stuff. And now I just put them in there with an air stone.
Yep.
And then I just close it up tight, and the air stone creates enough humidity that they end up laying eggs after 2 days. So that's kind of how I'll do that. And then my baby bumblebee toads, I wish I had a way to show pictures on here, but I don't know
I
how any of
can
it works.
post
But
some when I edit.
sure. So my baby toads, I take a sterilite bin, and when they first hatch out, I keep them in a sterilite bin that just has some holes poked in the top so I can keep the humidity pretty high. I'll put some sphagnum moss and then some actual moss and then some Ficus pumila plants in there. And then I just mist and feed springtails for a couple of weeks. Then I move them to a bigger sterilite bin, probably 6 inches tall and like I don't know, 20 inches by 10 inches or something like that. And the top I've cut out and put a big thing of like window screen on it. And then that's kind of the thing. What I do on the bottom, what I do with that sterilite bin though, is I actually take a second sterilite bin and I double them up, and I poke holes in the one so that it can drain into the second one. And so I've got holes for it to drain out any extra water or anything like that that happens to go in there. Then the other thing I do is I take a piece of window screen, and instead of lining the bottom with dirt or paper towels or something like that, I line the bottom of my sterilite bin with a window screen. And then I put leaf litter on top of that, and I put, I don't know, like moss and sphagnum moss and plants and stuff like that. And then I'll cut out some plant saucers, and I'll cut out some little holes, and I'll just use those as like little caves all over it. And I think it's a and then I'll put some like calcium clay in there. So I'll sprinkle some calcium clay all over. And then I think it works pretty well because the bumblebee toads, if you put them on dirt, it sticks to them when they're really little and it's hard for them to get around. But if you put them on like paper towels and stuff, I feel like you don't get your springtail cultures to really boom the way that they could. And so by keeping that window screen in there, like if I go into that sterilite bin right now, I have one in the laundry room. If I lift up that window screen, there's thousands of springtails underneath that window screen. So the window screen keeps just enough moisture that then the springtails can go up and down through the window screen and the bottom of that sterilite bin. And then it also gives the bumblebee toads something to grip onto as they're walking around. It's like the perfect amount of like grippiness for them.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what I do for bumblebee toads. I think it's a little bit different than how some people do it, but there's not enough people breeding them to really have like a set, like, oh, this is what works.
Right. Yeah. It's amazing. I keep my newly metamorphosed bumblebee toads in deli cups, like 10 or 15 of them per cup. And keep in mind, if people aren't familiar, when a bumblebee toad metamorphoses and comes out of the water, it can easily fit on like an eraser on a pencil. It's quite small. But yeah, you like just climbing around on sphagnum moss is like climbing Mount Everest for them. It's like they have a really hard time moving around. They're not adept at moving. They're kind of funny little animals that way. But they survive. They survive just fine. That's a pretty cool system you got, though, with the window screen over the springtail culture. I like that idea. A tip, something I use for hides for them, if you go to a hardware store, they sell black foam pipe insulation. It looks like a pool noodle, except it's hollow on the inside, so you can like put it over your plumbing to keep the plumbing insulated. I cut those in half and then cut them in half again, so now they're a little archway. And I use those as hides because I'm not worried about ever crushing them, because I used to use pieces of cork bark. And sure enough, like with mantella, baby dart frogs and bumblebee toads and even terrestrial newts over the years, like you pick up your cork bark and you look, and like a bunch of little creatures scurry around, and like you move them out of the way real gentle, and you very gently put that piece of cork bark down. But sure enough, do that enough times and you're gonna smush and accidentally kill these tiny little creatures. And so now I use the foam now because there's almost no chance of it crushing a baby animal.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's pretty good.
It's just one thing until they're big enough to handle.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Yeah, the bumblebee toads, they're not like, their movements they're not like thoughtful movements a lot of the time. Like they're just moving and stopping at random. I don't know how they're deciding when they're moving and stopping. And so like I feel like a lot of times if I have certain newts, like if I put them down, I start to put something on top of them. Most of the time the newts will like run off and scurry away. But bumblebee toads, sometimes they do that thing where if they get scared, they arch their backs. Have you seen you've seen them do that? Yeah. And I feel like the babies just have something in them that just goes like, it's just that the fight or flight is like, it's nothing I can recognize. It's nothing where I go, oh, this is when they'll run and this is when they'll stop running. So yeah, I could see like, but I don't really use cork bark either. I use the little plastic plant saucers, and they're the small ones, and I'm just cutting off the edges of them. And I started doing that because I needed something for newts that was shallow, and so that ended up working fine, but it works fine for them. The other thing I do is I just put a lot of leaf litter in there, and a lot of the bumblebee toads are just hiding in the leaf litter most of the time anyway. They're just, if I lift up a big leaf, there's like 4 of them under there at any time. But
same. Yeah,
I think, whenever I sell the bumblebee toads to people, I hope that they'll breed them, but I have not had that many people come back to me and tell me like, I got them to breed and I'm doing this. So when I first started breeding them, I asked Laura Abraham, I was like, how many people do you think are out there breeding these things? She's like, I don't know. She's like, I think I know like 3 people in all of the United States. And she was the only person I found that had them. So I didn't think there was that many. And I don't know how many there are now, but it's just the size of them that's crazy. When you say like will fit on a pencil eraser, I would like, if people don't know, they're probably, when they come out of the water, the size of maybe 2 Heidi fruit flies, but I would say maybe not even that big, maybe the size of a Heidi and a half or something. Like they're so small, and it just is what really keeps people from being able to breed them successfully, especially because they come out in such crazy numbers. Some dart frogs come out pretty small, but it's like 1 or 2 dart frogs in a terrarium is not hard to keep alive. There's enough little springtails just hopping around there on its own that it'll be fine. But when you have like 100 bumblebee toads, you have to have a system set up for getting enough springtails to make that work. So,
yeah, for sure.
Yeah, they are tiny.
Yep.
They're really tiny.
Cool. Yeah, bumblebee toads are awesome. More people should keep them and breed them for sure. Keep a nice decentralized group going in the hobby so that they're available to everyone. Well, Sean, for sure, you promised me in the email that you'd have no shortage of things to chat about, and I agree. We could keep going. Maybe we'll have to do another one of these someday.
Yep.
If people do want to check out your reels of your Tyler Triton eating, or if they want to see pictures of how you have your bumblebee toadlets set up, where should they find you on social media?
Yeah, so I have an Instagram. Like I said, I'm not trying to make this a business anymore. So if you're going to find me, you're just like me, just trying to meet other people and just say hi or whatever. But I have an Instagram. It's just my first and last name, Sean, last name Twohy with no space. I have a Facebook, and on that Facebook, it's just hobby. Like I'm not doing anything with that Facebook except for hobby. So all the friends and stuff I have on there are just hobbyists. I did recently try to start a subtropical and temperate terrarium Facebook page that's getting almost no traction. So if anybody wants to go and start following that, I only did it because I want to get ideas for myself for my own terrariums. And whenever I go look at terrariums, a lot of times it's just dart frogs or things that don't have to do with newts and toads and things like that. And I want to see terrariums where people are planting a lot of temperate sort of things. You know, if you even Google it, there's like 15 terrariums that come up if you Google temperate terrariums. And I just want to get ideas for cool looking stuff on that. So I figured if we had some sort of page that was dedicated to that, maybe we'd get kind of a base of pictures and stuff. But other than that, yeah, I have a morph market and it's toads and newts and other aquatic life. And when I have stuff to sell, I'll go on there and sell stuff on Morph Market sometimes. But like I said, I've really cut down on selling. But if you have something cool to trade, definitely let me know.
Right on. Well, thanks so much for chatting with us. Coming on the podcast. I appreciate it. Just another message to the audience. This is a new amphibian podcast, and so we'd like to build an audience. So I'm glad you found us, and if you listened this long, you belong here because this held your attention. But give it a like, subscribe, and share it. Whether you're watching on YouTube or you found this on one of the podcast channels, stay tuned, keep up and stay tuned for the next episode of the Frograck Podcast. Thanks a lot, everyone. Good night.
Thank you.